Part 1. The Stop-It was a quiet Tuesday evening when 19-year-old David was driving back home from the university library. He had spent the last 4 hours studying for his economics exam, and all he wanted was to get home, eat dinner, and maybe watch something on Netflix before bed. The neighborhood he was passing through was one of those fancy areas with big houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and expensive cars parked in every driveway. David's car wasn't fancy. It was a 7-year-old sedan that his parents had given him when he started college. The paint was a bit faded, and there was a small dent on the back bumper from when he had backed into a pole during his first week of driving. But it ran well, and David took good care of it. He always made sure it was clean and the maintenance was up to date. As he drove down the tree-lined street, his phone was connected to the car's Bluetooth, playing some lo-fi music to help him relax after the long study session. His backpack sat on the passenger seat, stuffed with textbooks, notebooks, and his laptop. He was wearing his university hoodie, the one with the school logo on the front that his mom had bought him as a gift when he got accepted. Then he saw the flashing red and blue lights in his rear-view mirror. David's heart immediately started beating faster. He hadn't been speeding. He had used his turn signals. His registration was current and all his lights were working. But still, that familiar feeling of anxiety washed over him. It was the same feeling he got every time he saw a police car, even when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He carefully pulled over to the side of the road, putting his car in park and turning off the engine. His father had taught him exactly what to do in situations like this. Keep your hands on the steering wheel where they can see them. Don't make any sudden movements. Be polite, answer their questions. Don't argue. His dad had given him this talk so many times that David could recite it in his sleep. 2 officers got out of their patrol car. Through his side mirror, David could see them approaching, one on each side of his vehicle. The officer who came to his driver's side window was a white man in his early 40s with a stocky build. His name tag read Officer Davis. The other officer, Officer Klein, was younger, maybe in his late 20s, and he positioned himself near the passenger side, his hand resting casually on his belt. David rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Officer Davis said without any greeting. His tone was cold, almost bored. "Yes, sir," David replied politely. "My license is in my wallet in my back pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" Officer Davis just stared at him, not responding. David took that as permission and slowly reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license with careful, deliberate movements. Then he leaned over to open the glove compartment, retrieving his registration and insurance papers. He handed everything through the window to Officer Davis, who took them without saying thank you. The officer looked at the documents, then looked at David, then back at the documents again. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Davis asked, his eyes narrowing. David was confused by the question. "I'm just driving home, sir. I was at the library studying. Where do you live?" "About 10 minutes from here, over on Westbrook Avenue." Officer Klein walked around to the driver's side and leaned down to look into the car through David's window. "This your car?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Well, technically it's my parents' car, but they let me use it for school." "Uh-huh," Officer Klein said, not sounding convinced. He exchanged a look with Officer Davis that David couldn't quite read, but it made him even more uncomfortable. "Can I ask why you pulled me over?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady and respectful. "I don't think I was speeding or anything." "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Officer Davis said, still holding David's license. "Description of what?" David asked, genuinely confused. "There was a robbery reported in this area earlier today. The suspect was a young black male." David felt his stomach drop. That wasn't a description. That was just his race and approximate age. That could describe thousands of people in the city. "I've been at the library all evening, sir. I have my student ID and my library checkout receipt if you need to see them. I haven't been involved in any robbery." Officer Davis didn't seem interested in seeing any receipts. Instead, he handed David's documents to Officer Klein and said, "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Am I being arrested?" David asked, his anxiety spiking. "Just step out of the vehicle," Officer Davis repeated, his voice getting firmer. David's hands were shaking now, but he complied. He opened the car door slowly and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The evening air was cool and he could see some neighbors starting to come out of their houses. Curious about what was happening. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood of the car," Officer Davis instructed. David did as he was told, feeling completely humiliated. He was aware of the neighbors watching, of the way the officers were treating him like he was a criminal when he had just been driving home from studying. His face felt hot with embarrassment and frustration. Officer Klein started going through David's car, opening the doors and looking through his belongings. Officer Davis stood behind him, watching him carefully as if he might suddenly run or do something dangerous. "What were you really doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Davis asked again. "I told you, sir. I was just driving home from the university library. I'm a student. I've been studying for my economics exam." A small smirk appeared on Officer Klein's face as he pulled David's backpack out of the car. "A student, huh? Let's see about that." David watched helplessly as the officer unzipped his backpack and started pulling out his belongings. His textbooks, his notebooks with all his careful notes, his laptop, his calculator, his pens and highlighters. Everything was spread out on the hood of the car like evidence at a crime scene. "Expensive stuff for a college kid," Officer Klein commented, holding up David's laptop. "Where'd you get this?" "My parents bought it for me when I started college," David said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "It's for my schoolwork." The two officers looked at each other again, and David saw Officer Davis suppress a laugh. It was subtle, just a slight shake of his shoulders, but David caught it. They were amused by this situation. They were enjoying making him uncomfortable. More neighbors had come out now, and David could see some of them had their phones out, probably recording. At least if something went wrong, there would be witnesses. But that thought didn't make him feel much better. It just made the whole situation feel even more surreal. All he had done was drive home from the library. He hadn't broken any laws. He hadn't done anything wrong. But here he was, standing on the side of the road with his hands on his car, being treated like a suspect, while two police officers went through all his personal belongings and questioned whether he had the right to be in this neighborhood. And the worst part was, David knew exactly why this was happening. It wasn't because of anything he had done. It was because of how he looked. And no amount of good grades, politeness, or compliance was going to change that in this moment. Part 2, the humiliation. "Turn around," Officer Davis commanded, and David slowly turned to face the two officers. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Officer Klein was still going through his backpack, pulling out each item and examining it like it might be stolen goods. He held up one of David's textbooks, a thick economics book that had cost almost $200 at the campus bookstore. "Introduction to Microeconomics," the officer read aloud with a mocking tone. "Pretty fancy reading material." "It's for my class," David explained, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm studying economics at Westfield University." "Westfield, huh?" Officer Davis raised his eyebrows. "That's a pretty expensive school. How does someone like you afford a place like that? Someone like you." The words hung in the air, and David knew exactly what the officer meant. He felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. It would only make things worse. "I have a partial scholarship, and my parents help with the rest," David answered, maintaining his respectful tone even though he wanted to scream. Officer Klein let out a short laugh. "A scholarship, right." He said it like he didn't believe David at all. Like the idea of David earning a scholarship was some kind of joke. "I can show you my student ID," David offered. "It's in my wallet." "Oh, we'll definitely be looking at that," Officer Davis said. He took David's wallet from where it sat on the hood of the car and started going through it. He pulled out David's student ID card and held it up to the light, examining it closely. "This could be fake." "It's not fake, sir. You can call the university and verify if you want. I'm a registered student. I've been there for 2 years." But the officers weren't interested in verifying anything. Officer Klein had moved on to the trunk of the car now, and he popped it open without asking permission. David wanted to protest, wanted to ask if they even had the right to search his car like this, but he remembered his father's words. "Don't argue. Don't give them a reason. Just cooperate and get home safely." The trunk was mostly empty except for a spare tire, some jumper cables, and a gym bag with workout clothes that David hadn't taken out after his last visit to the campus recreation center. Officer Klein unzipped the gym bag and pulled out the clothes, sniffing them dramatically. "Phew, someone needs to do laundry," he joked, and Officer Davis chuckled. David felt his face burning with humiliation. A small crowd had gathered now, about 7 or 8 neighbors standing on their lawns or on the sidewalk, watching the whole scene unfold. Some were openly recording on their phones, others were just staring. David wanted to disappear. He wanted to wake up and find out this was all just a bad dream. Officer Davis's radio crackled, and another patrol car pulled up behind the first one. 2 more officers got out and walked over to join them. This was escalating, and David didn't understand why. What had started as a simple traffic stop now had 4 police officers surrounding his car. "What do we have here?" one of the new officers asked. "Found this one driving through the neighborhood," Officer Davis explained. "Says he's a college student, but we're not so sure. Vehicle registration comes back clean, but that doesn't mean much. Could be his parents' car, could be borrowed, could be a lot of things." "It is my parents' car," David interjected. "I already told you that. They let me use it for school. I have insurance, registration, everything is legal." "Nobody asked you to speak," Officer Davis snapped, and David immediately fell silent. One of the new officers walked around David's car, peering into the windows. "Nice phone," he commented, pointing at David's smartphone that was sitting in the cup holder. "Latest model, too. Where'd a college kid get the money for that?" "It was a birthday gift from my parents," David said quietly. "Your parents sure buy you a lot of expensive things," Officer Klein said with a smirk. "Must be nice." The way he said it made it clear what he was implying. That David couldn't possibly have these things legitimately. That somehow a young black man with a decent car, a laptop, and a smartphone must have obtained them through illegal means. David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His hands were still shaking, and he clasped them together to try to stop it. He didn't want the officers to think he was nervous because he was guilty of something. He was nervous because 4 armed police officers were surrounding him, treating him like a criminal, and he had no idea how to make it stop. "Look," David said, trying one more time. "I understand you're just doing your job, but I really haven't done anything wrong. I was at the library studying. I can show you the books I checked out. I have a receipt with a timestamp. I have my student ID. I can give you my professors' names and phone numbers if you need to verify that I'm really a student. I just want to go home." Officer Davis stepped closer to David, invading his personal space. "You know what your problem is," he said, his voice low. "You talk too much. You keep explaining things nobody asked about. Innocent people don't need to explain so much." David felt trapped. If he stayed quiet, they treated him with suspicion. If he tried to explain, they said he was talking too much. There was no right answer here. No matter what he did, these officers had already decided he didn't belong in this neighborhood, and nothing he said was going to change their minds. A woman from one of the nearby houses called out, "Officers, is everything all right?" "Does this young man need help?" "Everything's fine, ma'am," Officer Davis called back without taking his eyes off David. "Just a routine stop. Nothing to worry about, but it didn't feel routine." David had been pulled over once before, when he had accidentally rolled through a stop sign during his first year of driving. That officer had been professional. He had explained the violation, given David a warning, and sent him on his way within 5 minutes. This was completely different. This felt personal. Officer Klein was back at David's belongings spread across the hood of the car. He picked up one of David's notebooks and started flipping through it. "What's all this?" he asked, looking at David's notes. "Those are my class notes. For economics and statistics, Looks like a lot of numbers here. You doing some kind of accounting? Keeping track of something?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. The officer was looking at his homework notes and trying to make them sound suspicious, like he was keeping records of illegal activity instead of just studying for his classes. "It's homework," David said, his voice starting to show his frustration despite his best efforts. "It's just schoolwork." "Don't get an attitude with me," Officer Klein warned. "I'm not, David stopped himself. There was no point. Nothing he said was going to make this situation better. Another car slowed down as it passed by, the driver looking out the window at the scene. More witnesses, more people seeing him treated like this, more people who would remember seeing a young black man pulled over, surrounded by police, his belongings scattered across his car. They wouldn't know he was innocent. They would just see the scene and make their own assumptions. Officer Davis's radio crackled again. "Control, this is Unit 12. We're going to need a few more minutes here. Still investigating?" "Copy that," the voice on the radio responded. "Investigating what?" David wanted to scream. What crime am I supposed to have committed? But he kept his mouth shut because he knew that any protest would only make things worse. So he stood there on the side of the road watching strangers record his humiliation, while 4 police officers treated him like he was public enemy number 1, all because he had driven through the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin color. Part 3. The escalation, 20 minutes had passed since David was first pulled over, and he was still standing on the sidewalk, watching the officers go through his belongings. His legs were getting tired, and the cool evening air was making him shiver in his thin hoodie. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the emotional exhaustion that was really getting to him. Officer Davis was now on his phone, apparently running David's information through some kind of database. Officer Klein had finally stopped rummaging through the car and was leaning against the patrol vehicle, arms crossed, watching David like he might suddenly make a run for it. "Everything's coming back clean," Officer Davis muttered to his partner, sounding almost disappointed. "No warrants, no priors, registration is current, insurance is valid." Officer Klein responded, still not looking convinced. First time for everything, David felt a small surge of hope. If everything was checking out, maybe they would finally let him go. Maybe this nightmare would be over soon and he could just go home. "Look, officers," David said carefully, "you've checked my license, my registration, my student ID. Everything is legitimate. I haven't done anything wrong. Am I being detained or am I free to go?" The moment those words left his mouth, David knew he had made a mistake. Officer Davis's expression darkened and he pushed himself off the patrol car, walking toward David with deliberate steps. "Are you being detained?" Officer Davis repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you go to law school too? Or are you just one of those people who watches too many videos online?" "I'm just asking about my rights, sir." You thought what? You thought you could tell us how to do our job?" Officer Davis stepped even closer, and David instinctively took a step back. "Let me tell you something. When we pull someone over, we decide when the stop is over. Not you, us, got it?" "Yes, sir," David said quietly, his heart sinking. He had just been trying to understand the situation, but now the officers seemed even more hostile than before. "You know what your problem is?" Officer Klein chimed in, walking over to join his partner. "You're being difficult. We're out here trying to keep this neighborhood safe and you're being uncooperative." David wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Uncooperative. He had done everything they asked. He had stepped out of the car, let them search his belongings, answered all their questions politely. What more did they want from him? "I'm not trying to be difficult," David said, forcing himself to stay calm. "I've cooperated with everything you've asked. I just want to understand what's happening." "What's happening is that you're being investigated," Officer Davis said firmly. "And if you keep questioning us, we can add obstruction to the list of problems you're going to have tonight." The threat hung in the air. David felt his stomach twist. Obstruction? For asking if he was free to go? This was getting out of control and he didn't know how to make it stop. One of the neighbors, an elderly white man, called out from his porch. "Officers, excuse me, but how much longer is this going to take? That young man has been standing there for quite a while." "Sir, please stay back," Officer Klein called out. "This is police business." "I'm just saying it seems like an awfully long stop for a traffic violation," the neighbor persisted. "Nobody said it was a traffic violation," Officer Davis shot back. "Now please let us do our job." David felt a tiny bit of gratitude toward the neighbor for speaking up, but it didn't change his situation. If anything, the officers seemed more irritated now. Officer Davis turned back to David. "You know what, since you want to know about your rights so badly, let me explain something to you. We can keep you here as long as we need to complete our investigation, and right now I'm not satisfied that you've told us everything we need to know." "I have told you everything," David protested. "I was at the library studying. I was driving home. That's it. There's nothing else to tell." "Then why were you really in this neighborhood?" Officer Klein asked again, as if David hadn't already answered this question multiple times. "This isn't the direct route to Westbrook Avenue from the university. You took a detour." David tried to remember his exact route. He'd been tired after studying and he might have taken a slightly different way than usual. But so what? Was he not allowed to drive on public streets? "I might have taken a different turn than usual, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. I have every right to drive on these streets." "Every right," Officer Davis repeated mockingly. "You hear that? He knows all about his rights. He turned to his partner. You want to tell him what happens to people who think they know better than police officers? The threat was barely veiled now, and David felt real fear for the first time since this whole thing started. This wasn't just a hassle anymore. This was potentially dangerous. Can I call my father? David asked, his voice shaking slightly. Please. I just want to let him know where I am. Both officers looked at each other and then burst out laughing. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cruel mocking. You want to call your daddy? Officer Klein said between chuckles. What's Daddy going to do? Come pick you up from the police station. Yeah, call Daddy, Officer Davis added, still laughing. Tell him to bring bail money. I'm not under arrest, David said, his voice stronger now despite his fear. You said I'm being investigated. That's not the same as being arrested. So yes, I want to call my father. That's my right. Officer Davis stopped laughing, his expression turning cold. You really don't know when to shut up, do you? I just want to call my father, David repeated. I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want my family to know where I am. The two officers had a whispered conversation that David couldn't quite hear. Then Officer Davis turned back to him with a smirk. Fine, you want to call Daddy? Go ahead. Let's see what happens when Daddy gets here. Maybe he can explain to you how the real world works. Officer Klein pulled out David's phone from where it sat in the cup holder and tossed it to him. David caught it, his hands still trembling. He unlocked the screen and found his father's number in his favorites. As the phone rang, David's mind was racing. His father was going to be worried. He was going to be angry, but more than anything, David just needed to hear his father's voice. He needed someone to tell him that this was going to be okay. Hello? His father's voice came through the speaker, calm and familiar. Dad, David said, and he hated how shaky his voice sounded. Dad, I've been pulled over. I'm on Maple Street and Fifth Avenue. I need you here. There was a brief pause, and David could imagine his father processing the information, staying calm the way he always did in a crisis. Are you safe? His father asked. Yes, sir. I'm okay. But I need you to come here, please. I'm on my way, his father said without hesitation. Stay calm. Be respectful. I'll be there soon. Okay, David said, feeling a small sense of relief. Okay. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Officer Klein, who took it with an amused expression. Well, that was touching, the officer said sarcastically. Don't worry, we'll wait right here with you until Daddy arrives. Officer Davis chuckled. This should be good. I love it when parents show up thinking they're going to save their kids. Always makes for good entertainment. David didn't respond. He just stood there, trying to hold himself together, counting the minutes until his father would arrive. He had no idea what would happen when his father got there, but at least he wouldn't be alone anymore. At least someone would be there who believed him, who knew he hadn't done anything wrong. The officers went back to their casual conversation, occasionally glancing at David like he was some kind of curiosity. The neighbors were still watching, still recording. The whole scene felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else, and David was just watching from outside his own body. All he could do now was wait and hope that when his father arrived, somehow this situation would get better instead of worse. Part 4. The call after. David hung up with his father. Officer Klein was still smirking, turning the phone over in his hands before placing it back in the car. So what does Daddy do for a living? He asked with mock interest. Let me guess, he's a lawyer, right? Everyone thinks calling a lawyer is going to make us disappear. David didn't answer. His father had told him to stay calm and be respectful, and that's exactly what he was going to do. He wasn't going to give these officers any more ammunition to use against him. Cat got your tongue now? Officer Davis chimed in. A minute ago you couldn't stop talking about your rights. Now suddenly you're quiet? The other two officers who had arrived earlier were still standing nearby, observing the situation with varying degrees of interest. One of them, a younger officer who hadn't said much, looked somewhat uncomfortable with how his colleagues were handling things. But he didn't speak up. He just watched. Officer Davis pulled out David's student ID again, examining it under the streetlight that had just flickered on as evening turned to dusk. Westfield University, he read aloud. You know, I've been a cop in this city for 15 years, and I've stopped a lot of Westfield students. Mostly for drunk driving, noise complaints, that kind of thing. Rich kids who think they can do whatever they want. I wasn't drinking, David said quietly. You can give me a breathalyzer test if you want. I haven't had anything to drink. Nobody said you were drinking, Officer Klein jumped in. But it's interesting that you brought it up. Makes me wonder what else you might be hiding. David closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. There was no winning here. Everything he said was being twisted into something suspicious. He decided to just stay silent and wait for his father. Officer Davis walked back to the patrol car and leaned against it, speaking into his radio again. David couldn't hear everything he was saying, but he caught fragments. Something about running additional checks, something about waiting for a supervisor's call. This wasn't ending anytime soon. A few more cars passed by slowly, drivers rubbernecking to see what was happening. Each time David felt a fresh wave of humiliation. He wondered what they were thinking. Were they assuming he had done something wrong? Were they feeling sorry for him? Or were they just glad it wasn't them standing on the side of the road? One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman, approached cautiously. "Excuse me," she said to Officer Klein. "I live right there in the blue house. I've seen this young man drive through here before. He's never caused any trouble. Are you sure this is necessary?" Officer Klein turned to her with an expression that made it clear her input wasn't welcome. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what this individual has or hasn't done. We're conducting an investigation based on reported criminal activity in this area." "What criminal activity?" the woman asked. "I haven't heard about any robberies around here today." "That's because we don't broadcast every crime report to the neighborhood," Officer Davis interjected, walking over. "But I appreciate your concern. Now, if you could please return to your home, we'll handle this." The woman looked at David with sympathetic eyes before walking back to her house. At least someone believed he wasn't a criminal, David thought. At least someone saw him as a human being. The minutes dragged by slowly. David checked his watch. It had been about 15 minutes since he called his father. Depending on where his dad was coming from, it could take anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes for him to arrive. David just had to hold on until then. "So while we're waiting for your dad," Officer Klein said, walking back over to David's car and picking up one of his textbooks, "why don't you tell me more about this scholarship you mentioned?" "What kind of scholarship did you say it was?" David sighed internally. They were back to questioning him again. "It's an academic scholarship. I had a high GPA in high school and good test scores." "Uh-huh. And your parents, what do they do?" David hesitated. His father had always taught him not to name drop or use his position to get special treatment. He believed everyone should be treated with equal respect regardless of their job or status. But David was starting to wonder if maybe just this once, he should mention what his father did for a living. No, he decided. His father wouldn't want that. And besides, his dad had said he was on his way. These officers would find out soon enough. "My mother is a nurse," David answered. "And my father works for the city." "Works for the city," Officer Davis repeated. "Doing what?" "Sanitation. Public works." The way he said it made it clear he was trying to demean whatever job David's father had. David felt anger flare up again, but pushed it down. "He's in administration," David said vaguely, which was technically true. Officer Klein laughed. "Administration. That's a fancy way of saying he pushes papers, right?" David didn't respond. Let them think whatever they wanted. They'd figure it out soon enough. Officer Davis's radio crackled again. "Unit 12, what's your status?" Officer Davis picked up his radio. "We're still on scene. Waiting for the subject's parent to arrive. We've completed our search. Vehicle comes back clean, no contraband found, subject has no warrants or priors." "Copy that."
"Do you need to continue the stop?"
There was a pause. Officer Davis looked at David, then at his partner. David held his breath. This was it. They had found nothing wrong. His record was clean. His car was legal. They had no reason to keep him here. "Yeah, we're going to wait for the parent," Officer Davis said into the radio. "Want to make sure everything is settled before we clear the scene." David's heart sank. They were keeping him here out of spite now. There was no legitimate reason for this stop to continue, but they were doing it anyway. Maybe to teach him a lesson. Maybe because they could. Maybe because they enjoyed the power they had over him. "You know what I think?" Officer Klein said, leaning back against the patrol car. "I think you got nervous when we pulled you over. I think maybe you were doing something you shouldn't have been doing and you got scared. That's why you were so quick to call Daddy. That's why you keep asking about being detained." "I got nervous because being pulled over makes anyone nervous," David said, trying to keep his voice level, "especially when you haven't done anything wrong and you're being treated like a criminal." There you go again, Officer Davis said, shaking his head. Playing the victim card. You know what? That attitude right there is probably why you got pulled over in the first place. David felt like he was in some kind of twisted alternate reality where nothing made sense. He got pulled over because of his attitude? That didn't even make logical sense. They pulled him over before they ever spoke to him. But there was no point in arguing logic with people who had already made up their minds about who he was based on the color of his skin. More time passed. David's legs were aching from standing for so long. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to get comfortable. Officer Klein noticed and smirked. Getting tired? Well, maybe next time you'll think twice before giving officers a hard time. I haven't given you a hard time, David said, exhaustion creeping into his voice. I've done everything you asked. After arguing about it first, Officer Davis countered. David didn't remember arguing about anything, but there was no point in saying that. These officers had created their own version of events in their heads, and nothing David said was going to change that narrative. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David saw headlights approaching. A dark sedan pulled up behind the patrol cars, and David felt a wave of relief wash over him. His father was here, but as he watched his father step out of the car, David noticed something he hadn't expected. His father wasn't alone. There were other vehicles pulling up behind him, official-looking vehicles with city markings, and suddenly the smirks on the officers' faces started to fade. They didn't know who had just arrived, but they were about to find out. And David had a feeling that everything was about to change. Part 5. The Arrival. The first thing David noticed was how quiet everything suddenly became. The officers stopped their casual banter. The neighbors who had been talking among themselves fell silent. Even the evening sounds of the neighborhood seemed to pause as everyone turned to watch the vehicles that had just arrived. 3 unmarked black sedans pulled up in formation behind his father's car, followed by a patrol vehicle that had distinctive markings David recognized immediately. It was a supervisor's car, the kind that captains and higher-ranking officials used. David's father stepped out of his vehicle first. He was wearing a dark suit, perfectly pressed with a tie that looked like he had just left an important meeting. Even from a distance, David could see the set of his father's jaw, the way he carried himself with calm authority. This was his father's work mode, the version of him that David had only seen a handful of times. Behind him, several other men and women in professional attire emerged from the unmarked vehicles. They all had the same air of authority, the same purposeful way of moving. These weren't just random people his father had called for backup. These were officials, important ones. Officer Davis straightened up from where he had been leaning against the patrol car. Officer Klein's smirk had completely vanished. The other 2 officers who had been standing around looked suddenly alert, uncertain. "Good evening, officers," David's father said as he approached. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it that David rarely heard. His father stopped a few feet away from the group, his eyes immediately going to David. "Son, are you all right?" "Yes, sir," David managed to say, his voice coming out a bit shaky from relief. His father nodded once, then turned his full attention to Officers Davis and Klein. That's when David saw it. The recognition, the moment it clicked in their minds. The color drained from Officer Davis's face, and Officer Klein actually took a step backward. "Chief Wellington," Officer Davis stammered. "Sir, we didn't realize that was my son," David's father finished for him. "Yes, that's my son who you've had standing on the side of the road for the past 40 minutes, Chief Wellington." David watched as the reality of the situation sank in for the officers. His father wasn't just some administrator who pushed papers. He was the chief of police for the entire district. He was their boss's boss's boss. One of the women who had arrived with his father stepped forward. She was holding a tablet and had an official-looking badge clipped to her belt. "Chief, I've pulled the body camera footage from the stop. All 4 officers' cameras. Do you want to review it now?" "Yes," Chief Wellington said without taking his eyes off Officers Davis and Klein. "But first, I want to hear from these officers exactly what probable cause they had for this stop." Officer Davis opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at his partner, then back at the chief. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity in the area. A vehicle matching this description was..." "A vehicle matching what description?" Chief Wellington interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying weight. "Please enlighten me. What was the description?" A dark sedan, sir, driven by a young black male." "A dark sedan," Chief Wellington repeated slowly. "Driven by a young black male. That's the description you used to justify this stop?" The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Klein looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world right now. One of the other officers who had been standing nearby actually took several steps back, distancing himself from the situation. "Sir?" Officer Davis tried again. "We were following protocol for investigating suspicious vehicles in the area. There had been a report of—" Chief Wellington held up his hand and Officer Davis immediately stopped talking. "Let me ask you something. How many dark sedans do you think drove through this neighborhood tonight? How many young men of any race do you think passed through here in the last hour?" Officer Davis didn't answer. "And yet," Chief Wellington continued, "you pulled over my son. You made him stand on the side of the road for 40 minutes. You searched his vehicle, his belongings, questioned him repeatedly about what he was doing in this neighborhood. You made him feel like a criminal in his own city." David watched his father's face. He was angry. David could see it in the tight set of his jaw, in the way his hands were clenched at his sides. But his father's voice remained steady, professional. This was worse than yelling. This was controlled fury. "Chief, if we had known that he was your son," Officer Klein started. "If you had known he was my son, what?" Chief Wellington cut him off sharply. "You would have treated him with respect? You would have been professional? You would have actually followed proper protocol instead of racially profiling a college student who was driving home from the library?" The woman with the tablet spoke up. "Chief, I've reviewed the initial footage. There was no traffic violation. The vehicle didn't match any specific BOLO or be on the lookout report. The stated reason for the stop was driving in a high-end neighborhood." "Driving in a high-end neighborhood," Chief Wellington repeated, letting the words sink in. He turned to look at David, really look at him, and David saw something in his father's eyes that broke his heart. It was disappointment. Not in David, but in the system he worked for, in these officers who worked under him. "David," his father said gently, "tell me what happened here tonight." David took a breath and started from the beginning. He explained how he had been pulled over, how the officers had asked what he was doing in the neighborhood, how they had searched his car and his belongings, how they had mocked his student ID and questioned whether his laptop and phone were legitimately his. He explained how when he had asked if he was being detained, they had accused him of being difficult and threatened him with obstruction charges. As David spoke, he watched the expressions of the other officials who had arrived with his father. Some looked angry. Some looked disappointed. All of them were taking notes. When David finished, Chief Wellington turned back to Officers Davis and Klein. "You threatened my son with obstruction charges for asking about his legal rights?" "Sir, he was being argumentative." Officer Davis tried, was he? Chief Wellington's voice got harder. Or was he being a scared 19-year-old college student who was being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin? One of the men who had arrived with Chief Wellington stepped forward. He was wearing a suit with a supervisor's badge clearly visible. "Chief, if I may, I've been listening to the body camera audio. I haven't heard anything that constitutes argumentative behavior from the young man. He was polite, compliant, and respectful throughout the entire stop." "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez," Chief Wellington said. He turned back to the officers. "Let me ask you both something, and I want honest answers. If my son had been white, would you have pulled him over?" Neither officer answered. "If he had been a white college student in a decent car wearing a university hoodie carrying textbooks, would you have stopped him? Would you have searched his belongings? Would you have kept him standing on the side of the road for 40 minutes while you questioned what he was doing in this neighborhood?" The silence was answer enough. David looked around at the crowd that had gathered. The neighbors were still there, still recording. They had captured everything. The initial stop, the humiliation, and now this, the arrival of the chief of police to defend his son. It would probably be all over social media by morning. Chief Wellington walked over to David and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, son," he said quietly, and David could hear the emotion in his father's voice. "I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry that in 2025 you still have to deal with this. I'm sorry that having a father in law enforcement didn't protect you from racial profiling." David felt tears prickling at his eyes, but he blinked them back. "It's not your fault, Dad." "No," his father agreed. "But it is my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen again." Not to you, not to anyone else's son or daughter. He turned back to face the officers, his expression hardening again. Officers Davis and Klein, I'm placing you both on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into this stop. You'll surrender your badges and weapons to Captain Rodriguez. Sir, please, Officer Davis said, his voice rising in panic. We were just doing our jobs. We didn't know. You didn't know he was the chief's son, Wellington finished. And that's exactly the problem. Every person you stop should be treated with the same respect and professionalism you would give to the chief's son. Every black man, every brown woman, every person regardless of their race or background. That's what the badge means. That's what being a police officer is supposed to be about. Officer Klein looked like he might argue, but Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with an outstretched hand. Badges and weapons, officers now. Reluctantly, both officers unclipped their badges and removed their service weapons, handing them over to the captain. The other two officers who had been part of the stop looked nervous, wondering if they were next. Chief Wellington addressed them. Officers Thompson and Garcia, you'll also be included in the investigation. I want to know why neither of you intervened when you saw this stop going beyond reasonable bounds. Yes, sir, they both mumbled. Part 6. The reckoning. The street was now bathed in the flashing lights of multiple police vehicles, creating an almost surreal scene. David stood next to his father, finally feeling safe for the first time in over an hour, but the situation wasn't over yet. Chief Wellington turned to the woman with the tablet. Lieutenant Chen, I want a complete review of all body camera footage from the moment these officers activated their lights until right now. I also want footage from any dashboard cameras, and I want to see the dispatch logs for any reported robberies or suspicious activity in this area today. Already on it, Chief, Lieutenant Chen replied, her fingers moving quickly across her tablet screen. Initial review shows no robbery reports filed for this neighborhood today. The last incident report for this area was 3 weeks ago, a noise complaint. No robbery reports, Chief Wellington repeated, his voice carrying across the street so everyone could hear. Officers, you told my son you pulled him over because he matched the description of a robbery suspect. But there was no robbery. Officer Davis looked at the ground. Sir, we may have been mistaken about the specific incident, but we had reasonable suspicion based on the vehicle and the time of night. Reasonable suspicion, Chief Wellington said slowly. Let me explain something about reasonable suspicion to you, Officer Davis, since you seem to have forgotten your training. Reasonable suspicion requires specific and articulable facts, not hunches, not stereotypes, facts. He began pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, every inch the commanding officer. A young black man driving a registered vehicle on a public street is not reasonable suspicion. A college student wearing his university hoodie is not reasonable suspicion. Someone being in a neighborhood you personally think they don't belong in is not reasonable suspicion. That's called racial profiling, and it's illegal. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with a folder. Chief, I've pulled the officers' stop records for the past 6 months. Davis has conducted 47 traffic stops. Of those, 39 were drivers of color. Klein has 42 stops. 35 were drivers of color. That's almost 85%, Lieutenant Chen observed, looking up from her tablet. Chief Wellington nodded grimly. And what's the demographic breakdown of this district, Captain? Approximately 53% white, 28% black, 15% Hispanic, 4% Asian and other, Rodriguez read from the folder. So in a district that's roughly half white, these two officers are stopping people of color at nearly double that rate. Chief Wellington turned to face Officers Davis and Klein again. Do you two understand what these numbers mean? They mean you're not doing your jobs fairly. You're targeting people based on race. Sir, with all due respect, Officer Klein said, his voice defensive. Crime statistics show that certain neighborhoods have higher crime rates, and we patrol accordingly. Crime statistics, Chief Wellington said, and David could hear the anger building in his father's voice now. Let me tell you about crime statistics, Officer Klein. When you over-police certain communities, when you stop people in those communities at higher rates, of course you're going to find more violations there. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it does nothing to make anyone safer. All it does is destroy trust between police and the communities we're supposed to serve. He pointed at David. My son was not in a high-crime neighborhood tonight. He was driving through one of the wealthiest, safest areas in the city. And yet you pulled him over because you decided he didn't belong there. Because a young black man in a nice neighborhood must be up to no good. That's not policing, that's harassment. One of the neighbors, the elderly man who had spoken up earlier, stepped closer to the group. "Chief Wellington," he called out. "I've lived on this street for 30 years. I want you to know that young man has never caused any problems. I've seen him drive through here before, always cautious, always follows the traffic laws. What these officers did tonight was wrong, and everyone here saw it." Several other neighbors nodded and voiced their agreement. One woman held up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing. If you need it for your investigation, I'll send it to you." "Thank you," Chief Wellington said to them. "Your testimony and evidence will be important. Lieutenant Chen will take your contact information." He turned back to address everyone present, his voice carrying authority. "Let me be clear about something. This isn't just about my son. This is about every person in this city who has been stopped, questioned, searched, or harassed simply because of how they look. This is about every parent who has to have the talk with their children about how to survive a police encounter. This is about rebuilding trust that has been broken by exactly this kind of behavior." Officer Davis finally spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "Chief, we're sorry." "If we had known—" "Stop," Chief Wellington cut him off sharply. "Don't tell me you're sorry because he's my son. Tell me you're sorry because you treated a human being with disrespect. Tell me you're sorry because you violated the oath you took to serve and protect all citizens equally. Tell me you're sorry because you let your prejudices override your training and your duty." The silence that followed was heavy. David watched the two officers, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, he saw something other than arrogance on their faces. Whether it was genuine remorse or just fear for their careers, he couldn't tell. But at least they weren't smirking anymore. Lieutenant Chen approached the chief with her tablet. "Sir, I've compiled the complete timeline." The initial stop had no stated traffic violation. The extended detention exceeded reasonable bounds after the first 10 minutes when all checks came back clear. The search of the vehicle was conducted without explicit consent or probable cause, and there are multiple instances of unprofessional conduct on the audio recording, including mocking my son for wanting to call his father. Chief Wellington added, "I heard that part loud and clear on your body camera, Officer Klein. You laughed at a teenager who was scared and asked for help. Does that make you feel like a good police officer?" Officer Klein didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, his face flushed with either shame or anger. David couldn't tell which. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Chief, what do you want us to do with the other responding officers? Thompson and Garcia?" Chief Wellington looked at the two officers who had arrived as backup. They looked young, probably hadn't been on the force for more than a couple of years. "Officers Thompson and Garcia, you didn't initiate this stop, but you participated in it. You stood by while your fellow officers violated this young man's rights. That makes you complicit. You'll both undergo remedial training on civil rights, proper stop procedures, and the duty to intervene when you witness misconduct." "Yes, sir," they both said quickly. "And let this be a lesson to you," Chief Wellington continued. "When you see something wrong, you speak up. You don't just go along with it because you're the junior officer, or because you don't want to make waves. You have a duty to do what's right even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "To all the residents here tonight, I want to apologize on behalf of the police department. What you witnessed was not the standard we hold ourselves to. It was not acceptable and it will not be tolerated. My administration is committed to fair and professional policing for everyone in this city, regardless of race, background, or neighborhood." One of the neighbors called out, "What happens now? Are these officers going to face real consequences, or is this just going to blow over?" "Real consequences," Chief Wellington assured her. "This incident will be fully investigated by our Internal Affairs Division. The officers involved will face disciplinary action up to, and including termination, depending on the findings. The body camera footage, witness statements, and all evidence will be reviewed, and I promise you, this will be handled transparently." Lieutenant Chen leaned in and spoke quietly to the chief. But in the quiet of the street, David could hear her. "Sir, this is going to be all over the news by morning." "The community is already sharing videos and photos on social media." "Good," Chief Wellington said firmly. "Let it be news. Let people see what happens when officers abuse their authority. And let them see that there are consequences. Transparency is the only way we rebuild trust." He put his hand on David's shoulder again. "Son, do you want to press charges? False detention, violation of civil rights. You have grounds. David thought about it for a moment. Part of him wanted to say yes, wanted these officers to face everything they deserved for how they treated him. But another part of him was just exhausted. He just wanted to go home, take a shower, and try to forget this night ever happened. "I don't know, Dad," David said honestly. "I just want this to be over." "I understand," his father said gently. "But think about it. This isn't just about you. This is about sending a message that this behavior has consequences. This is about the next young person who might be stopped by these officers." David looked at Officers Davis and Klein. They were both watching him now, and he could see the worry in their eyes. Good, he thought. Let them worry. Let them understand what it feels like to have your life disrupted, to be made to feel powerless. Part 7. The Statement. The crowd that had gathered on the street was still watching, phones still recording. Chief Wellington looked at the faces of the neighbors, and David could see his father making a decision. This moment was bigger than just one traffic stop. This was an opportunity to address something that had been festering in the community for years. Chief Wellington took a step forward, addressing everyone directly. His voice was strong but not harsh, commanding but not cold. "I know many of you don't know me personally. I was appointed as chief of police for this district 3 months ago. Before that, I spent 20 years working my way up through the ranks in various departments across the state. I took this job because I believed I could make a difference. I believed I could help transform the relationship between law enforcement and the communities we serve." He paused, and David could see emotion flickering across his father's face. "Tonight I learned that my own son, who has never been in trouble with the law, who is an honors student at one of the best universities in the state, who has done everything right, was still not safe from racial profiling. And if my son isn't safe, then no one's child is safe." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others just listened, their expressions serious. "This is exactly the kind of policing I was hired to eliminate," Chief Wellington continued. "This is what erodes trust between police and community. This is what makes people afraid to call us when they need help. This is what turns law enforcement from protectors into something people fear." He gestured toward where the patrol cars had been parked. "Those officers made several critical mistakes tonight. They initiated a stop without reasonable suspicion. They extended a detention without probable cause. They searched a vehicle without consent or justification. And worst of all, they treated a young man with disrespect and prejudice based solely on the color of his skin." David watched his father, seeing him not just as his dad but as the leader he had become. This was why his father had taken this job. Despite David's mother's concerns about the stress and the long hours, his father genuinely believed he could change things from the inside. "I want to be very clear about something," Chief Wellington said, his voice growing stronger. "What happened here tonight is not acceptable under any circumstances. Not because the victim was my son, but because it should never happen to anyone. Every person in this city, regardless of their race, their age, their neighborhood, or their background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement." One of the neighbors, a young black woman holding a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "Chief Wellington, that's nice to hear, but we've heard promises before. How do we know this time will be different? How do we know this isn't just talk?" "That's a fair question," Chief Wellington acknowledged. "And honestly, words alone aren't enough. You need to see action, so let me tell you what's going to happen starting tomorrow." He began counting on his fingers. "First, every officer in this district will undergo mandatory retraining on civil rights, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. Second, we're implementing a new accountability system where officers must document and justify every traffic stop with specific articulable facts. Third, we're establishing a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. And fourth, we're creating a community liaison program where residents can directly communicate concerns to department leadership." Lieutenant Chen was taking notes on her tablet, nodding at each point. "But beyond policies and procedures," Chief Wellington continued, "we need a fundamental shift in culture. Officers need to understand that they work for the community, not above it. They need to see every person they interact with as someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's parent, someone's neighbor. They need to remember that respect and dignity aren't optional parts of the job. They're the foundation of it." An elderly white man stepped forward from the crowd. "Chief, I'm Robert Harrison. I'm a retired judge. I've lived in this neighborhood for 35 years, and I want to say that what I witnessed tonight was appalling. But I'm encouraged by your response. The question is, will the police union support these reforms, or will they fight you every step of the way? Chief Wellington smiled grimly. That's another fair question, Your Honor. The union will have concerns, I'm sure. But I'm not asking for permission to do what's right. These reforms are necessary, and they will be implemented. Any officer who can't meet these standards should find another line of work. David noticed Captain Rodriguez shifting slightly, and he wondered if the captain was thinking about the resistance they would likely face. Change was never easy, especially in institutions as old and established as police departments. Chief Wellington wasn't finished. I also want to acknowledge something that's probably obvious to many of you. For years, communities of color have been telling us about experiences like what my son had tonight. They've been telling us about being stopped for no reason, about being treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods, about living with constant suspicion and surveillance, and too often those concerns have been dismissed or ignored. He looked at David, and there was pain in his father's eyes. I thought I understood. I've been a black man in America my whole life. I've been a black police officer for 20 years. But until tonight, until I saw my own son standing on the side of the road being humiliated and harassed, I don't think I fully grasped how personal this is for every family in our community. David felt his throat tighten. His father rarely showed this much vulnerability in public. So I want to say to everyone who has had an experience like this, to everyone who has been profiled or mistreated or made to feel less than human by law enforcement, I believe you. I hear you, and I am committed to making sure it stops. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. This incident with my son will be investigated thoroughly and transparently. The findings will be made public, the officers involved will be held accountable, and we will use this as a catalyst for real, lasting change. He turned to look directly at the cameras that several people were holding. I know this is being recorded and shared. Good. I want people to see this. I want them to know that this is a turning point. I want other police departments to see that there are consequences for racial profiling and abuse of power. And I want young people like my son to know that their dignity and their rights matter, no matter who their parents are or aren't. A woman in the crowd called out, Chief Wellington, what would you say to other parents having the talk with their kids about how to survive a police encounter? Chief Wellington took a deep breath. I would say that I hate that we still have to have that talk in 2025. I hate that I had to teach my son to be extra careful, extra polite, extra compliant, just to stay safe during a traffic stop. No parent should have to fear for their child's life when they see police lights in the rearview mirror. He paused, collecting his thoughts. But until we fix this broken system, parents do need to have that conversation. Teach your kids to keep their hands visible, to comply with instructions, to be respectful even when the officer isn't. Not because it's fair, but because it might save their life. And then teach them that none of this is their fault, that they deserve better, that we all deserve better. David felt tears stinging his eyes again. His father had given him that exact talk when he first got his driver's license. He had practiced it with David, role-playing different scenarios. At the time, David had thought it was excessive. Now he understood why his father had been so insistent. One more thing, Chief Wellington said, and his voice took on a harder edge. To any officer watching this in my district or elsewhere, let me be absolutely clear. If you cannot treat every person with equal respect and dignity, you do not belong in law enforcement. If you cannot set aside your biases and prejudices, you do not belong in law enforcement. If you see the badge as a license to harass and intimidate rather than serve and protect, you do not belong in law enforcement. He let that sink in for a moment. This is not just about punishment for these specific officers. This is about setting a standard for what we will and will not accept as a department and as a community. Every officer needs to know that their actions will be scrutinized, that body cameras aren't just for show, that complaints will be taken seriously, that abuse of power will have real consequences. Lieutenant? Chen stepped forward and whispered something to the chief. He nodded and turned back to the crowd one last time. Thank you all for being witnesses tonight. Thank you for recording what happened. Thank you for speaking up. Communities and police need to work together, and that starts with accountability on both sides. My office will be in touch if we need any formal statements. He put his arm around David's shoulders. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to take my son home. It's been a very long night for both of us. As they started walking toward his father's car, several neighbors approached to shake Chief Wellington's hand or pat David on the shoulder. "Stay strong, young man," one older woman said. "You handled yourself well tonight." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. The adrenaline was starting to wear off and exhaustion was setting in. Part 8. The aftermath. David woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing continuously on his nightstand. He had fallen asleep almost immediately when he got home the night before, emotionally and physically drained from the ordeal. His mother had hugged him tight when he walked through the door, tears in her eyes, while his younger sister had looked at him with a mixture of concern and anger about what had happened. Now, looking at his phone, he saw dozens of missed calls, text messages, and social media notifications. The videos from last night had gone viral. Completely viral. Millions of views across multiple platforms. The hashtag ChiefSon was trending nationally. He scrolled through some of the comments. Many were supportive, praising his father for standing up for him and promising real change. Others were skeptical, saying this was just performative because it was the chief's son and nothing would actually change. And then there were the hateful comments, the ones that made David's stomach turn, saying he probably deserved what happened, or that his father was playing the race card. There was a knock on his bedroom door. "Come in," David called out, sitting up in bed. His father entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He was already dressed in his uniform, though it was barely 7 in the morning. He handed 1 cup to David and sat down in the chair by his desk. "Couldn't sleep?" David asked. "Not much," his father admitted. "I've been on the phone since 5 a.m. dealing with the media, the mayor's office, the police union. It's going to be a long day." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing everything that had happened. "Dad," David finally said, "are you going to be okay? I mean, with your job and everything? I don't want this to mess things up for you." Chief Wellington smiled sadly. "David, you're the one who got harassed by police officers and you're worried about my career? Don't. I chose this job knowing it would be difficult, and if standing up for what's right cost me this position, then it wasn't the right position for me anyway. But you worked so hard to get here. You wanted to make changes from the inside. And that's exactly what I'm doing," his father said firmly. "Real change doesn't come from staying silent when it's convenient. It comes from standing up when it's hard. What happened to you last night should never happen to anyone, and I'm going to make sure people remember that." David took a sip of his coffee, thinking about his father's words. "I saw the videos online. People are saying a lot of things. I'm sure they are. What matters is what we do next." His father leaned forward. "David, I need to be honest with you about something. This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. The media is going to want interviews. There will be investigations, hearings, probably protests and counter-protests. Your life is about to change in ways neither of us anticipated." "I know," David said quietly. "I've already gotten interview requests from like 5 news stations. You don't have to do any of them if you don't want to. Your mother and I will support whatever decision you make. You can stay private or you can speak out. Both choices are valid." David thought about it. Part of him wanted to just disappear, to go back to being a normal college student, but another part of him knew that staying silent meant nothing would change. "I think I want to talk about it," David said slowly. "Not to the news right away, but maybe at some point. Because you were right last night. This isn't just about me. How many other people go through this and don't have a father who's the chief of police to come rescue them?" His father nodded, looking proud. "That's very mature of you, son. But take your time. Process what happened first. Talk to someone if you need to. This kind of experience, it can affect you in ways you don't expect." Over the next few days, the story exploded across the nation. Major news networks picked it up. Op-eds were written. Civil rights organizations released statements. The incident became a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about police reform and racial justice. True to his word, Chief Wellington launched a comprehensive investigation into the traffic stop. The body camera footage was released to the public, and people could see for themselves exactly what had happened. The footage clearly showed Officers Davis and Klein had no legitimate reason for the stop, that they had mocked and belittled David, and that they had violated multiple department policies. 2 weeks after the incident, the results of the investigation were announced at a press conference. David attended with his father, sitting in the front row while Chief Wellington stood at the podium in full uniform. After a thorough review of all evidence, including body camera footage, witness statements, and dispatch records. Chief Wellington announced to the packed room of journalists and community members. The investigation has concluded that Officers Davis and Klein engaged in racial profiling, violated department policy on traffic stops and searches, and demonstrated conduct unbecoming of police officers. He paused, letting that sink in. Officer Davis has been terminated from the police force effective immediately. Officer Klein has also been terminated. Officers Thompson and Garcia, who responded as backup but failed to intervene, have received written reprimands and will undergo remedial training. Additionally, both Officers Davis and Klein are facing misdemeanor charges for violation of civil rights. The room erupted with questions from reporters, but Chief Wellington held up his hand for silence. Furthermore, starting next month, every officer in this district will undergo a comprehensive retraining program. We're implementing new protocols for traffic stops that require officers to document specific, articulable facts for every stop. We're launching the Civilian Oversight Board, which will have independent authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. And we're establishing monthly community forums